and thank you for coming today. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Today, we have Dr. Jessie Matheson. She's a teacher and cultural historian with specialisations in women's agricultural and film history. Thank you, Jessie.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. I also want to start today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land I'm on now, and also where most of this research was undertaken. I pay respects to their elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We're on stolen land, as were the people who I'm talking about today. I'll be telling you about people who had their autonomy and their rights to self-determination eroded by the state. But this notion was nothing new to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait women of the AWLA, nor of any of the Aboriginal people working, often for little or no money, on farms and in rural communities. In the context of where we are today in 2023, with a referendum incoming and Nazis marching on the steps of Parliament at time of writing, I also want to spotlight the work of Faith Bandler, who, before she was an inspiring and pivotal campaigner for the 1967 referendum Yes campaign, was an AWLA member who joined because she believed she had a duty to fight Nazism and fascism from rising in Australia. I want to begin today with the story of the Cowra experimental farm. In 1917, at the height of World War I, the Australian government began to contend with the possibility of a rural labour shortage and reflect on the success of the British Women's Land Army. A course was opened at Cowra for women to be trained in the same farming skills as men. The venture was quickly celebrated for its near-revolutionary potential. In a dispatch to troops abroad in May of 1918, it was boldly claimed that the success of the Cowra venture demonstrates that women can be usefully employed at what is regarded as the most laborious form of agricultural life. It was thought that outside beekeeping, poultry raising, and flower gardening, there would be not much scope for women on the land, but one only has to see them driving the sturdy draft horses at Cowra to realise that women are competent workers in avenues from which it was previously thought their sex would debar them. Soldiers abroad were heartily assured that the sunburnt lassies of the Cowra experimental farm were a picture of health and not afraid of hard work. Yet just 2 years later, in 1920, as global hostilities had ceased and concerns of the post-war employment of veterans proved intractable, Cowra suddenly seemed to have demonstrated a remarkably different reality of rural womanhood. At the closure of the farm, the Minister for Agriculture informed the local press, "If we decide to train women at all in the arts of agriculture, it is obvious that they are best adapted for poultry, dairy, beekeeping, farming, or horticulture. We have no right to attempt to teach them general farming and wheat growing. The work is too heavy." My interest in the Australian Women's Land Army stemmed from my doctoral research, which explored the cultural and political history of women working on farms. My finding was that these two histories were irrevocably linked, that how we as a culture saw women on farms was ever so closely tied to their political fortunes. Put simply, in those times where women farmers were celebrated, the kind of legal protections and recognition that they wanted came through. In those times where they weren't, well, suffice it to say that my project was part of an ARC grant for the Invisible Farmer Project. The AWLA, the Australian Women's Land Army, provided essential rural labour in most Australian states from 1942 until some months after the war ended. During this time, the Manpower Directorate, the body tasked with active service and industry support recruitment during World War II, elicited obedience to military-style norms of discipline from AWLA members, in part by assuring them that they could expect to be made an official Fourth Women's Auxiliary Service. As a women's organisation, in addition to the expectations that they would conform to these norms, there was an expectation that they would also confine to feminine ideals of duty and quiet support. Both these expectations reinforce the ideal that AWLA members should happily and dutifully follow the directions of Manpower and their employers, and they should do so without expectation of public recognition. AWLA members were never granted this official auxiliary status, nor most of the rights and privileges it would have conferred. The experience of AWLA members demonstrates how women's labour was conceptualised, controlled, and ultimately marginalised during and after the Second World War. The status of the AWLA as an unofficial fourth service significantly influenced the culture of the AWLA during the war. After the war, it continued to play a role in how the women of the AWLA were acknowledged and commemorated, as not fully aligned with other civilian workers, nor official members of the women's services. This talk explores the significance of this ambiguity. During the war, the privileges awarded to AWLA members and the discourses of control under which they were subject were closely tied to their status, not just as essential war workers, but as an army. The similarity between their organisation and the auxiliary services was striking, and along with some explicit promises that they would surely be made an official auxiliary service, with uniforms, codes of conduct, and remote barrack-style living became a foundation upon which life as a member of the AWLA was conceptualised. As the war ended, assurances of their soon-to-be conferred official status became paired with optimistic visions of how members could continue their service to the nation as ambassadors of rural lifestyles, but not as representatives of the Australian Armed Services, who could walk in victory parades and later in Anzac Day marches. Before 1942, the growing rural labour shortage was partially managed by women who had developed their own land armies, modelled on the British Women's Land Army of World War I. Mostly middle-class rural women, these groups trained women and arranged to send them to farms in need of additional, usually free labour. When war broke out in the Pacific, attitudes surrounding Australia's role in the war changed profoundly, as Australia became not only a primary Allied supplier, but also a base for American troops. The somewhat ad hoc approach Australia had taken thus far to rural and primary production was now seen as insufficient. The federal government nationalised volunteer women's land armies, which became the Australian Women's Land Army under the control of the Manpower Directorate in October of 1942. While women's volunteer paramilitary groups had made up the first recruits of the women's auxiliary services, the AWLA began its life and remained a civilian organisation. Despite this civilian status, nationalisation did lead to greater legal rights and stricter barriers to entry. Recruits could legally be sent anywhere the directorate desired, quote, in many cases irrespective of the desires and personal disadvantages of the individual, and be dismissed for inefficiency or indiscipline. Nationalisation fundamentally changed the nature of the Land Army. As the AWLA, it was subject to the ambitions and scrutiny of manpower, who expected conformity to military-style norms and discipline. By May of 1943, 6 months after nationalisation, the AWLA had over 2,000 permanent members. National recruitment campaigns were efficient, targeted, and stressed both the patriotic spirit of the AWLA, as well as assurances that recruits would be performing a conforming feminine kind of duty, with slogans such as "Food is a munition of war," and "Food is vital to your husband, sweetheart, or brothers." Yet Manpower privately conceded that the AWLA offered, quote, very little attractive inducement, but much hard work. It is likely that they consciously emphasised the striking visual similarities between the AWLA and other auxiliary services to imply that the AWLA offered comparable benefits to joining auxiliary service, even though they knew it did not. And I want to take a moment now to draw attention to the image on the slide here. The AWLA woman is fourth from the left, and I'm sure you'll notice the really striking similarity between her and the woman representing the Australian Women's Army Service, who's second from the left. Frequently in their dress uniforms, AWLA women recorded being confused with AWAS women. And I think it's really significant that if you look at this kind of row of women, it's pretty unclear whether the fourth woman from the left should be kind of with the auxiliary services behind her or with the civilian services in front of her. She's very much on that borderline, and that's the kind of ambiguity we're talking about here. These similarities would be exploited throughout the war. Both individual complaints and more widespread discontent were often mediated by a reminder of the close alignment between AWLA labour and the labour of soldiers on the front. By the time the first issue of the Victorian Land Army Gazette was published in December of 1943, Manpower explicitly focused on their quasi-military status in response to members feeling tired and depressed, with what became a successful and often repeated platitude. "Each one of you is a fighter on the home front," wrote the Victorian Deputy General of Manpower with enthusiasm. "Soldiers all, comrade in arms, I salute you." In this respect, Manpower used the AWLA's proximity to military norms to quell disappointment and encourage a cheery conformity to militaristic expectations of discipline. The conferral of the AWLA with the title of Army aligned it closely with the auxiliary services. Indeed, many found the dress uniforms of the AWLA almost indistinguishable from that of the AWAS, as I've said. The brochures and posters highlighted special privileges which AWLA recruits would enjoy, including uniforms, their own monthly magazine, hostels, travel concessions, and even access to beachside holiday homes during time off. These were privileges they shared with members of the Women's Auxiliary Services. A refrain which occurred throughout various informational material was the assurance that the AWLA, from a national point of view, ranks equally in importance with the parallel branches of the services and enjoys the same amenity privileges. This ultimately was only occasionally the case, and certainly not with members who wished to access those services that could not be provided easily, quickly, or cheaply. Uniforms, which were eventually featured in elaborate recruitment material, were actually hard fought for by early members of the AWLA and their employers. Appropriate uniforms were indispensable to AWLA work on the land. One man contacted Manpower to inform that many of the land girls on his property were essentially working his farm in slippers. Gradually, Manpower distributed both appropriate footwear for rural work and dress uniforms, as well as other essential items. The Gazette reported that they were inundated with joyful letters offering thanks for the provision of towels as late as 1943. Yet, as with many dealings the AWLA had with those in power, it is unclear whether Manpower was reluctant to distribute uniforms due to pragmatic considerations, whether they simply did not feel that the AWLA represented a priority, or a combination of both. Indeed, historian Heather Gartshaw has found that there may have been some concern about what granting the AWLA status as a uniformed service could mean in future if AWLA women sought the post-war privileges of the auxiliary services. While Manpower grappled with this possibility, they exploited the idea that the AWLA status as an auxiliary service was unresolved, and used these kind of small symbolic gestures to reinforce the notion that AWLA women should behave as if they were in a defence force. Manpower was reluctant to offer AWLA member uniforms as legitimate and visible recognitions of their service, despite the increasing demand from farmers for more recruits. Once the AWLA was granted uniforms, many reported on the advantages of being recognised as a woman in service, including greater social acceptance from other women in auxiliary services and access to some food coupons and travel concessions. AWLA uniforms also performed practical and protective functions, and there's much anecdotal evidence that the high rates of pneumonia and other weather-related ailments decreased once women were provided with appropriate workwear. Go figure. Uniforms were an important expression of the general militarization of the AWLA. Along with their distinctive khaki color, the issue of service numbers, and the very use of the title Army, the AWLA was subject to similar hierarchies of command as in the auxiliary services. There was also a system of commendations for good or long service, which in fitting with military custom was represented with badges and ranking bars and chevrons to be attached to shoulder straps. AWLA members were bound by a standing order of service, and these were the methods upon which AWLA women were beholden to the control and discipline of the military, despite being excluded from the rights and privileges which conferral of official auxiliary status would have granted them. The first line in the standing orders section of the service book, which all AWLA members were provided with, reiterated the refrain: "The AWLA is a national women's service auxiliary of status akin to the women's service auxiliaries." The level of control Manpower expected of AWLA members was not, however, akin to the responsibility they felt to them. Through the Gazette, which was my primary source for this research, sent to AWLA members, the state would reinforce the idea that AWLA women should cheerfully carry on without recognition. This is where I get to tell you that the Gazette frequently published just some of the worst song lyrics I have ever read. When reporting on some of this research, sort of early in my time doing a PhD, I did kind of a pub history event where I made everyone sing this because it explicitly says you can sing it to any tune. But I won't be doing that today. Nobody has to sing, including me. Songs included choruses such as, "There's no time for senseless pining, with land girls feeling grand girls, toiling, grubbing, from rise to set of sun. Gosh, our work is never done." And, "You'll never see her marching while the people stand and stare. She works with all her might. She's doing her bit in the fight." So you see here, there's like this strong and explicit correlation between duty, relentless labor, and invisibility. They were supposed to do this without carrying on about it. For women of the AWLA, server and labor were defined by their willingness to work without the recognition they were frequently promised would soon come. For AWLA women, the message perpetuated in the Gazette that they should happily accept their assigned roles was also reflected in their workplace conditions. Women who undertook industrial action, even something as minor as refusing to work in the wet before being provided with raincoats, were usually subject to emotional blackmail and could be charged as unpatriotic. This lack of support and hostility towards any complaints from AWLA members left little room for members to express their anger. One woman bitterly remembered how the feeling of injustice I had just became worse, because the farmer was always right, never the land army girl. I knew it wasn't just. I started to get angry with them. I remember them blackmailing me about a good conduct star. AWLA members had very little autonomy regarding where they would work and what conditions they would work. While Manpower had not resolved whether they could legally compel recruits to work in locations and conditions they objected to, the possibility that perhaps they could was sufficient to quell some dissatisfaction and enforce obedience to their direction. When AWLA members or their parents raised such objections, Manpower would respond in terms of the women's patriotic duty. Their policy was to emphasize, quote, the national importance of the work, stressing the general shortage of labour. The ambivalence of the AWLA status once again constrained the extent to which Land Army members could resist the control of Manpower. I'm going to quickly digress here to talk about the significance of a kind of unique moral panic that AWLA women found themselves at the centre of. The AWLA was just one source of wartime rural labour. Another was that of Italian prisoners of war. Following their initial mobilisation, Italian POWs often worked alongside AWLA members, and despite some tension, this seems to have been mostly a success, as POWs often took on work that AWLA members were not able or allowed to do. By 1944, some concerns were beginning to be raised about the suitability of AWLA women and Italian POWs working alongside one another. Amongst the women, there was little consensus about working with or for Italian men. For many, they found the patriotic terms on which they were working was incompatible with friendly relations with aliens. For others, the opportunity to form relationships with people outside of their pre-war social world included POWs, and they would develop friendships and even flirt with their POW co-workers. Apart from the nationalistic, and has to be said often overtly xenophobic overtones to some women's objection to working with Italian POWs, the legal rights of AWLA women to raise these kinds of objections do suggest the ambivalent status of AWLA as neither fully military nor a fully civilian organisation. Their rights on this matter were certainly ambiguous, and whilst policy on AWLA and POWs working together was clear, in a memo it was conceded at, the point of issue is apparently what policy is to be followed when personal objections are raised by the land girl. Land girl being a term for AWLA members. It is apparently unclear to what extent an AWLA member could be forced to work in conditions they objected to. These one-off personal, often racist objections raised by some AWLA members and the extent to which women had the power to object to their deployment became a matter of public opinion by April of 1945. A tabloid newspaper, Smith's Weekly, published a story about an Italian POW who went into a Queensland AWLA hostel and harassed the matron there. Smith's Weekly published a number of articles throughout the years which panicked about white Australian women and racial others working during this period, including Italians and African American men. This article was titled, and I'm going to quote some offensive terms here to describe Italian people, because I do think it's important that we consider the violence of these objections. Dago's Pesta Land Army Girls, and concluded, "It is a disgraceful thing that Australian girls should be placed in a position where they are subjected to unwelcome attention from war prisoners." The article neglected to mention that this was the only such recorded incident, that the man had quickly been caught, and that he was found to have been mentally unstable and was quickly admitted to the mental section of a POW hospital, all of which the author's sources at Manpower had informed him of. It certainly did not mention that AWLA hostels often fended off drunk American and Australian soldiers. It did not report on the lack of measures that were put in place to protect AWLA women from other workers on farms that they were mandatorily assigned to, or that the only codified protection was that women could only be situated on a property which had at least one adult woman also residing there. It did not interview the state superintendents, who sometimes took their own initiative to inspect the male farmers who had requested AWLA members, although even this does not seem to have been a very stringent process. Agnes Hodgson, who was the Tasmanian state superintendent, remembered a group of 4 girls running away from a property of a man who had a reputation as Hodgson described, a sex maniac. Some women who used outdoor showers remembered American pilots flying over them whilst they were showering. Women whose sleeping quarters were on the verandas of farmhouses or on temporary accommodation far from the main house sometimes had men from town sneak into their rooms and had to frighten them off. Those women in hostels had only their matron to turn away drunk or rowdy groups of men, and on at least one occasion, women living in an AWLA hostel were subject to a violent assault. AWLA women had almost no autonomy to determine where they would work and in what conditions they would be housed, and there seems to have been very little clarity as to who was responsible for their safety. However, the popular narrative of pure Australian girls being harassed by dangerous and unpredictable foreigners proved more compelling to tabloid audiences. Most accounts of sexual assault and harassment are recorded from oral histories taken decades later. The harassment of AWLA members experienced at the hands of mostly white Australian American soldiers continued on, unaddressed by Manpower or the media. Soon after the Smith's Weekly article, it became policy that farmers had to choose between POW or AWLA labour, and many women were transferred to new locations. A powerful narrative about what rural womanhood was supposed to represent, with only the barest grasp of reality, was met with further erosion of AWLA women's autonomy. The closeness of AWLA to the Defence Forces implied expectations of submission to military norms. The question of whether AWLA members were able to unionise, for example, while never officially resolved, was discussed in terms of their pseudo-official status as members of the Defence Force. When the Australian Workers' Union did advocate for compulsory membership for all AWLA members, the request was initially dismissed by the Department of Labour and National Service for fear it would jeopardise the very viability of the AWLA, which I think in itself does tell you something about the conditions we're talking about here. Many women, in fact, were confused by suggestions that they should join a union, as they saw themselves as part of the army, and it was traditional for soldiers working in a civilian context for the army not to unionise. Even at a state level, the AWLA's status was ambivalent. In an address for Cabinet, the Minister of State for Labour and National Service reported that the AWLA was a, quote, uniformed service and conditions applying to it are, as far as practicable, similar to those women in the Women's Service Auxiliaries, the members of which are not, of course, required to belong to any union. Ultimately, a compromise was reached whereby the state would not support or discourage any information distributed about unions. However, this episode illustrates the close connection between AWLA's ambivalently civilian status and the kind of controls that were imposed upon them as an unofficially military organisation. Imagine, for example, if they had said, okay, as a military organisation, you can't unionise. Think about that possibility when we turn to the question of what happened to these women after the war had ended. When AWLA women sought to draw on these military structures for support, this ambivalence could be exploited. Women had little control over their work conditions, much like their peers in the Defence Force. However, when they were injured on the job, they were quickly reminded of their civilian status. Women like 19-year-old Evelyn Brown, who contracted rheumatic fever that escalated into endocarditis after being overworked on a farm in Victoria. She was offered no help from Manpower, who feared the precedent that would be set if they had taken responsibility for her illness. Instead, Manpower stressed that as a privately employed civilian, Brown's insurance should have been the responsibility of her employer. Brown's case illustrates how Manpower reaped the benefits of AWLA's alignment with the Defence Forces in terms of the control it gave them over women's work, but they could also cultivate a distance from this responsibility when it suited them. I do want to take a moment to point out that despite the consistent experience of frustration, overwhelmingly AWLA members that have been interviewed over the years seem to remember their day-to-day life in really positive terms, despite this ambivalence. They were working in new contexts. In fact, they were required to work in new contexts. AWLA women who came from farms had to leave those farms where they were usually working for free to go and work on other farms. And it was a transformative experience. One woman told an interviewer that she just felt like she was I felt I was finding myself. Another said she discovered a permanent love for land. I just feel like I belong there somehow. For many, their time in the AWLA is remembered with pride and distinguished with the cultivation of lifelong friendships. Amongst AWLA members, there was the opportunity for close friendship and for some sexual relationships. Particularly for those women who were placed in hostels, their home was a communal homosocial environment where they ate, slept, and worked together. And as you can see from this image on the left, where women are kind of gathered around this sort of metal sheet here, that's actually covering their drop toilet. They kind of created that sort of modesty sheet for themselves. You can see that despite some of the rhetoric that was coming across in the brochures, this is a sharp distinction from their lives of sort of conforming to feminine expectations, usually in the cities, usually from working class backgrounds. So it was a lot of change and a lot of freedom for a lot of women. During the war, there was little consensus among AWLA women on whether they would or should be treated as members of the auxiliary services, or whether an official change in status would be forthcoming. As the war drew to a close and their lives after the war came into focus, the question of what the state owed AWLA members became more urgent and more widespread. The distinction between service as a member of the Defence Force and civilian contributions to war may have blurred on multiple fronts during wartime. But in the post-war period, this distinction took on extra significance for how AWLA workers figured in post-war reconstruction and war commemoration. That after the war, women were expected to return to the social role they inhabited before 1939 has been well explored in Western women's historiography. The experience of AWLA members illustrates the ways in which women's wartime labour was marginalised in state reconstruction efforts and in public remembrance. Their status as beholden to particular wartime expectations of patriotic duty, but without any visible recognition of this work, was actively reinforced by Manpower and informed their post-war experience. Following VE Day, the Gazette continued to assure landgirls that they could expect official recognition at any moment. They were told their appeals for recognition were being addressed by the Prime Minister and Attorney General's Department, that national security regulations had been drafted to give full legal standing to the Australian Women's Land Army, and that these in present were receiving final consideration. Amidst these assurances, the Gazette's authors turned their attention to the continuation of the AWLA members' national service. As almost all members, except those who had found rural husbands in their time away would be returning to cities, ex-AWLA members would find themselves well-placed to become spokespeople for rural life. In the Gazette, AWLA members were encouraged to share stories of the self-reliance, patience, and intelligence of rural people in general and primary producers in particular. While given no inducement to stay in rural work themselves, there seems to have been a hope that as unofficial spokespeople, they could help address concerns surrounding post-war rural labour shortage, economic downturn, and a renewed sense that rural people were required to physically occupy Australia for purposes of national defence. A sharp irony, which I think has really stuck with me from when I first sort of found out about it, was that despite being explicitly told that AWLA members should not support the women who worked on these farms, which, we consider like household duties, like running the home, looking after the children, or even sort of working with like the chickens in the dairy, it was expected that AWLA women would return to the cities and talk about the kind of like happy lives that farmers' wives would have. This kind of like ironic tension is sort of present throughout all of these kind of like hopeful directions that the Gazette sort of sends to AWLA women. These women stayed in their positions longer than most other women wartime workers as well. They were given no support to stay on the land, and those who returned to work in the cities were years behind their peers in terms of any relevant experience, and many left the AWLA with depleted savings. Many were socially isolated and lacked the support systems put in place for women from the auxiliary services. Many were injured, thinking again here about Evelyn Brown, who was an orphan who could now no longer do any kind of physical labour. In the same issue in which the Gazette had promised that the question of their official status was receiving final consideration, it also became a feature for how AWLA members could fend for themselves once the war was over. For example, it was suggested that after securing training and the purchase of equipment and the purchase of a car at their own expense, they could become a travelling farm secretary. Really though, if they wanted to stay working on the land, the Gazette's authors proposed, they should marry a farmer. Quote, "For does not the old adage say, to be really happy, one must marry the man one loves as well as the life one lacks." The Gazette became much vaguer in its promises following September of 1945, despite the continued need for AWLA labour. Production must go on, they reminded their readers, reassuring them that their claims and needs are under consideration. Despite not being released from service, former AWLA members were promised that information regarding opportunities and openings will be forwarded later. Yet apart from an advertisement from the YWCA for a leadership course, such information never came. Despite the relentless positivity of the Gazette, it is clear that its editors were seeking to address real concerns. The expectation that women should submit to militaristic expectations of discipline was slowly replaced by a reassertion of their services as a realization of natural feminine duty. By the last issue of the Gazette, as it became certain that AWLA members would not receive official auxiliary status and would be given no support in finding employment either in the city or the country, included this final platitude, surrounded by numerous photos of recently married AWLA members. An abiding faith exists that the AWLAs, although getting no reinstatement benefits, will fend for themselves contentedly on Civvy Street, for their years of national service in the rural sphere has given them initiative, fearlessness, and an independence that can never be lost. The timing of the state's decision to officially not grant the AWLA auxiliary status is, of course, significant, and the shift in rhetoric is vividly remembered by ex-AWLA members. As Thelma Hunter told historians, "We were taken as the land army at the time. It was only after the war that they started saying we weren't recognised as an army. When the war was on, oh yes, we were well and truly recognised as an army." AWLA labour, which had so readily been determined by their alignment to the Defence Force, was now subsumed into broader narratives of civilian wartime service. In 1944, the Gazette had published a suggested opening chorus for a land army concert to be sung, quote, "anywhere, anytime." Bless all the bosses with their strictest rules. We get no promotion, so don't cause commotion. And cheer up, my girls, bless them all. There's many a service that we could have joined, but this job's classed A1. We know we're expected to go where directed and to see that our duty's well done. Nobody knows what rheumatics we've got, so cheer up, my girls, and bless them all. This song distills the close relationship between AWLA members' labour, indeed their overwork, and the expectation that they should submit to the authority of their employers and of manpower, and that they would do so cheerfully and with no expectation of recognition. If we think about the lyrics in this world, we have met AWLA members who had rheumatic fever. We have met AWLA members who were forced to work in unsafe locations or locations that they didn't want to work in without complaint. And we have heard about how women were not acknowledged for the work that they did. When the war ended, this chorus proved even more prescient. Despite the public and private objections of AWLA members and their supporters, the expectation of cheerful invisibility persisted for decades. AWLA women did march in the first victory parades throughout Australia, although many of them boycotted them in protest. One woman wrote in her diaries about how disgusted she was by the fact that in the radio broadcast of these parades, the Land Army wasn't even mentioned. In some broadcasts, they were just confused as a second contingent of Australian Women Army service members. And of course, this information that they had now been denied their auxiliary status impacted their ability to join victory parades overseas. And they were excluded, despite the strong objections of many rural politicians, from joining the victory contingent that went to London to march. There was a sense among many members of the AWLA and of some rural politicians that they had been subjects of an injustice, and this persisted throughout the 20th century. Yet gatekeepers of national remembrance precluded AWLA members from marching in Anzac Day parades until the 1980s. It was also around this time that they were awarded civilian service medals. The 1980s and 1990s represented a peak in public and historical interest in women's wartime service. Significant oral history projects on homefront experiences, including Sue Hardisty's Thanks Girls and Goodbye, from which many of the oral histories this paper has drawn on were undertaken, and public commemoration campaigns focused on democratic mobilization and mass appeal began to actively incorporate images of women, including AWLA members. So if you think back to kind of what my research focus was, it sort of suited the national interest now to think about how everyone was involved, and that included women. Recognition of the AWLA's wartime role served the national interest, and therefore they got the recognition that they had been asking for decades. However, for many women, these concessions came decades too late. Gwen Rowe reflected, "The attitude of the RSL was that we were not ex-service and therefore had no part in Anzac celebrations. Then 40 years onwards, when we're hardly able to get along, most of us, they finally agree we can march. In a country like Australia, it was a total war effort and that should have been acknowledged, but it wasn't." I hope this paper has gone some way towards illustrating how women's work in the AWLA was controlled and how this control has impacted their remembrance and the complete marginalisation of the privileges I and many former AWLA members believe they were legally or morally entitled to. However, without a doubt, the number one factor influencing how the AWLA has been remembered has been the members of the AWLA themselves. This is a cohort of women who worked tirelessly in oral history projects, both by community and by historians, and of advocacy campaigns to the RSL, to the state, to be appropriately acknowledged, respected, and remembered. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jessie. That was really fabulous. I'm still getting over the fact that they were supposed to still be feminine and fabulous while toiling away. I mean, me in the garden, just not a good look.
So many pictures of them like feeding little baby lambs and things.
Oh. If anyone's got any questions, you can type them into the Q&A. We've got a little bit of time. You said that there was some work that the women weren't allowed to do. What kind of work was that?
So the AWLA women, they didn't have a lot of training before they were set on farms. So usually operating heavy machinery was something they weren't allowed to do. The line between not allowed and not able sort of kind of comes into play there. So like there are things that like physically, like random women from the city being pulled onto a farm can't do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there were some kind of restrictions usually imposed just by the farmer. Those farmers that did kind of consider the insurance for women usually had more restrictions. So like to be properly insured, they kind of had to say, look, you know, they like might drive a tractor, but they won't be driving the combine harvester, you know?
Yeah, fair. Do you know what portion were sort of properly insured?
No, nobody knows. Even at the time, it was extremely unclear who was properly insured. And this is one of those things where like, we don't know this because Manpower kind of deliberately didn't want to know, because if they were counting who was properly insured, what kind of responsibility were they then taking on? And what kind of culpability were they then taking on?
Yeah, absolutely. Question, how did the Australian experience compare with that of Britain?
Look, there are similarities and differences. The big difference is that Britain had a land army in World War I.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those kind of mental barriers had kind of gotten over, and they sort of worked through a lot of these problems early on. So they had a land army start really, really early in Britain, and it was a lot more formalized. I can't really comment on their position sort of like post-war, except to say that that the land girls in Britain had kind of figure kind of strongly in post-war memory decades later. You know, like even things as simple as you get those TV shows about the land girls and things, which we just like never see here, right? New Zealand had a lot in common with Australia. The New Zealand Women's Land Army and the Australian Women's Land Army, they worked very, very closely together. A lot of their recruitment material was kind of identical. And particularly a lot of the kind of cultural barriers that they had to get over were very similar. So for example, both Australia and New Zealand kind of had to contend with the idea that on one hand, they needed to kind of assure girls and their parents that it was going to be kind of this like nice, soft, feminine, you know, lots of feeding of lambs and chickens and things. But they also needed to convince the farmers that the women could actually do the work, because a lot of them were really skeptical. You know, and then of course both countries kind of had this shift where after doing this huge recruitment campaign, they then had a surplus of farmers applying for AWLA labour. So then they had to kind of wind it back a bit. So they were sort of on a very similar trajectory.
Wow. And did Australia borrow much of the sort of, I guess, infrastructure, for lack of a better word, that Britain had already established?
Not so much the kind of bureaucratic structure, but definitely the rhetoric.
Wow.
Yeah, very consistent.
Amanda Bede says, I did an honours thesis that Sioux hardistry used in the 1980s, which included interviews. The number I spoke to stayed on the land without marrying. They were encouraged by farmers to stay on. They also became dairy testers.
Dairy testing is amazing, yeah. Sorry, continue.
No, that's okay. And she says, I guess people who came forward to be interviewed, they had positive experiences. Have you noticed that in the research, that people are maybe one way or the other?
I think like I want to stress that like a lot of the women who have interviewed, and I think I am my talk on this, and I'm really like serious about it when I say that like the AWLA members have been so active in their kind of campaigns to be sort of remembered and have their experiences documented. And I had a very similar experience. Like almost all of their oral histories, they report like really, really positive experiences. Like this is sort of the ambivalence of my research, is that kind of we've got these beautiful oral history projects of the AWLA that kind of sort of speak directly to like the experience of participants. And yeah, they speak really kind of positively of it. A lot of the kind of positive experiences are really ad hoc. So like, sorry, I forgot, is it Amanda?
Yes.
Yeah, like Amanda mentioned, you know, if you had like a local community that just like loved having land girls there, that community would come together and would kind of come up with supports for that person or for that group of women. But kind of my research interest is the role that the state played. And I think in terms of that, they had sort of no protection. And, you know, if they were sort of lucky enough to be in an area where they were really embraced by the community, where they were with a farmer that was sort of really interested in supporting them and like helping them stay on the land, that would work out great for them. And some were in communities where they were treated really terribly, where they were considered threats, where they were considered that they were going to take away the labor of the men when they came back, you know. So because there was no kind of control from the state, those experiences are really varied. And that really comes across because we have such a wide breadth of oral histories taken from AWLA women, you know, kind of across particularly the East Coast. What's really striking is you read a book like Sue Hardesty's, is how varied the experience is. And it's, you know, very much a lottery.
It's fascinating. Did the women receive any stipends or credits from the government, and was there any legal paperwork involved?
So they did receive pay, like they were employed. They received about 40% less than they would have if they were a man, but still more than if they were a POW or an Aboriginal worker. That's kind of where they sit in the hierarchy. Yeah, so they absolutely were paid. I would have to double check how that worked, whether the farmer was paid who then paid them, or yeah, I would have to double check those legal arrangements. But in addition to that, they also did have some benefits while they were there. So they did have travel concessions, for example. So they kind of, when they had leave, they were able to return home almost free. And again, that's kind of an important one in terms of their status, because they had these travel concessions, but before they had uniforms, they were often reported being, you know, confronted on trains, like, you're not supposed to be here. This is a carriage for the auxiliary services. Once they had a uniform, the uniform looked a lot like the AWAS. They reported being able to get on those trains a lot more freely. If that answers your question.
I think so. Do they get any travel to go to the farms?
Yes. Yeah. Usually by most reports, very long bus rides.
Did the women receive a service pension later in life?
No. So this is a really big part of like the issue here. So if they had been an official auxiliary service, they would have been entitled to a pension. Because they were not given that official status, they had no kind of like, so for example, if you were in the AWAS or the RAFs or the RENs, when you finished your service, there were all of these programs that you could join to help you rejoin the workforce. And you were entitled to things like pensions. If you were injured, that was the government's problem. If you wanted to march in the Anzac Day parades, that was your right. You can, you don't have to sign the guest book at the RSL anymore. None of that kind of got conferred to the Land Army.
Thank you again, Jessie. That was really, really fascinating.
And the Old Treasury Buildings exhibition is gorgeous, by the way. Like, it's was definitely very inspiring when I was doing my research.
Oh, fabulous. Yes, that is the Women Work for Victory in World War II. It's on at least till the end of this year. So if you are interested, come along and have a look. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. Our next talk is our next instalment in the Material History Seminar Series. We're talking about Australian food icons, namely Vegemite and the Australian Women's Weekly Birthday Cookbook. That's on the fabulous collection. That's on the 5th of May at 1 p.m. and booking details are on our website and through Eventbrite. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Jessie. Have a good day.